He's the founder of the Community Vision Partners, community and social solutions organization with a mission to initiate, facilitate, and agitate for the common good. And the best word I like there is agitate. Also, he is founder of the Chesapeake Sustainable Business Council, CSBC, a business-led educational advocacy organization. Steve's going to talk about the issue of inequality in Virginia and what we can do about it.
Thank you. What a great topic to talk about in this beautiful early spring morning, so I'll try to make it as entertaining as possible. Well, first, can you hear me okay? So, John, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really flattered and honored to be here. But before I start, let me also give you applaud your being here today. You're doing your civic duty, which is absolutely an important part of our democracy. And if we want to create any change or improve our world, obviously we need to keep doing things like this. So today's topic I've been tasked to talk about is how does inequity and poverty impact the future of Virginia? Well, frankly, it's a pretty straightforward and short answer, and that is it's a huge cost. Poverty and inequality is a huge cost, not only to Virginia, but frankly just about every state in our country and frankly throughout the whole world. So that's it. There's a huge cost. The future of Virginia can be impacted and will be impacted if we don't address these issues. So that's the answer. Thank you very much. So now we can continue on. I kid. But what I'm going to talk about today, because within less than 20 minutes, we're not going to be able to solve all the problems of the world, but I do want to sort of put things in perspective. And that is what's an even more important question to talk about in our discourse is not just what the cost is today. The real concern that I have is, and we all in this room have, is what's the cost if we don't address this issue?
Sir, can you talk louder?
Sure.
It's very difficult.
Okay. Okay.
There are a lot of people walking around. So if you can yell.
All right. So what's the cost if we don't address these issues now? If you think the consequences are deep and severe now, what happens if we neglect this? Now, I speak from personal experience as a real estate developer, inner city DC real estate development. And the rule of thumb when you own and maintain real estate is if you don't maintain it correctly, then the entire asset could be jeopardized. If you use Band-Aid solutions to maintain your property, for example, if you just ignore that little patch in the roof that's causing a little leak that you just want to ignore and not really put time and effort into, that's something that could eventually start rotting out your rafters. It could start affecting the integrity of your bearing walls, it could even go into the foundations and literally destroy your property and assets. So to some degree, if we don't address these issues now, we're opening up a huge, huge problem for the future of Virginia. So before I get into some specific costs of what Virginia will be facing if we don't address this issue, let me clarify what we mean by costs. Okay, when we talk about this issue in the public discourse or Fox News or just about any cable news station, we tend to talk in terms of numbers and figures and budgets and deficits. What we're not really understanding or putting out there is the real cost of the human struggle. We're talking about people here, folks. We're talking about families who, when they get foreclosed on, the strife and the trauma that's created in that one family alone, that eventually affects the entire community, or affects the child who's growing up in his formative years, living in circumstances that are extremely difficult. All these things add up ultimately to really impact not only the whole economy, but people, children who are being formed right now and who will eventually be the ones who are our future. So let me get into some of the reasons, some of the ways that Virginia could pay a cost if we don't address these issues. And they're pretty obvious issues. There's an economic impact, there's a social impact, and frankly, there's a huge environmental impact as well. Isn't it good now that we're finally getting to the point where we're not debating whether climate change is a real problem for humanity? and that human extinction is really something that is something that's not science fiction. So we have to consider that there's social, there's economic, and environmental costs that all are interconnected and all play upon each other. We're not going to get into much details because we can't really, but basically, in terms of the economic costs, well, the economic costs when you have too much poverty or inequity is that there's less reserves or resources for a state to work with. So in a consumer economy that we have in America, poverty and low and stagnant wages depresses consumer activity. When you depress consumer activity, you have less consumer resources to work with. The cost of investment is not invested in, and we hurt local commerce, we hurt the ability for municipalities to use resources effectively. We put a terrible burden on the social networks. And we add to the fact that revenue is being squeezed, the fact that revenue also, policies allow for massive loopholes and tax benefits and unfair tax policies, offshore tax shelters, constant pressure to lower corporate taxes and wages. So on one hand, we're losing revenues, on the other hand, we've got policies that are putting pressure on damping other sources of revenue. When you add all that up, of course, a state that doesn't have the resources to invest in its future is going to be a problem. So that's an economic issue. So the less resources we have, the less there's investment in schools, education, there's a greater inability to address real social issues and remedies. There's less resources to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and less investment in innovations in the 21st century industries that could help us grow and create a thriving economic recovery that will be long-lasting, deep, and affect all sectors. So that's an environmental impact. It's pretty straightforward. Now, of course, the important one cost to Virginia, which I think really interests a lot of people in this room, is the social cost. So once again, what's the cost that's involved? Well, with adults, the human capital costs are pretty immense. So adults, what happens when you have constant underemployment or you can't feed your children? It increases mental health issues. It puts pressure on families to subsist with a lot less to work with. You have physical health issues that aren't being addressed. You've got cheap processed foods that are contributing that you can only afford to contribute long term to all sorts of long-term issues: alcohol, substance abuse, mass incarceration, broken families, so on, etc. These all contribute to the social cost when it comes to adults. But it's the children that's a real vulnerability that we have here. If we don't invest in children, or we don't help the children in a lot of these families that are suffering from economic and food insecurity in many cases, we have a real problem. As we know, Margaret Mead is someone who's had some very outstanding quotes, and we're familiar with some of them. One quote that she has, that I'll bring to light here, is that there's no greater insight into the future than recognizing that when we save our children, we save ourselves. So are we saving our children? We invest in our children? The effects on children with poverty and inequity is not only temporary, it's lifelong, and goes into the next generation. So the effects such as persistent, frequent health issues, obesity, missing school, higher rates of accidents, maintaining poor food options, all these things add up to children who don't necessarily will perform well in school or have opportunities to grow and thrive and become a contributing part. They're more vulnerable to antisocial behavior, increased criminal activity, substance abuse and suicide, social isolation, all things that frankly don't really bode well for the future generation that we're going to need to rely on to make sure that Virginia has a thriving future. So there's a number of other issues that are tackled by the social price that we're paying with our high levels of poverty and inequality. We can continue on for the next few hours or so to cover some more of that, but obviously we can't. But the last part of the price that we pay in Virginia is the environment. So on one hand, if we don't have enough resources and revenue coming in, and then we have more burdens for the social safety net that we have to invest in, whether we end up doing that or not. If we don't, of course it costs us. When you take that together, then there's a lot less ability to address the environmental issues that finally we understand are undeniable. And I'm sure folks in Newport News and Norfolk will tell you that, yes, the ocean is really creeping up. Flooding is now something that's a regular part of their existence, so on, et cetera. Well, these are issues that we can't ignore. So if we don't have enough time or resources and priorities to put into our social and other responsibilities, how are we going to take care of this burden that is not going to go away?